England in the late 1300s was not a calm place. It was a country still fighting wars abroad, still carrying the shock of the Black Death, and still run by powerful nobles who were used to getting what they wanted. Into that world, a boy was born who would become king far too early, and would later be thrown off the throne in a way England had never really seen before. His name was Richard II. Richard was born in 1367. His father was Edward, the Black Prince, the famous warrior everyone admired. But Richard didn't get to grow up under his father's protection for long. The Black Prince got sick and died in 1376. A year later, in 1377, King Edward III died too. That meant England suddenly had a child king. Richard was only 10 years old when the crown was placed on his head. At that age, Richard could wear a crown, but he could not truly rule. England was really run by a mix of councils, older nobles, and royal family members. The most important figure around him was his uncle, John of Gaunt, powerful, rich, and feared. Another uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, also wanted influence. And behind all of them was a simple fact. A kid was king, and everybody knew it. Richard grew up inside this pressure cooker. He learned early that people smiled at him while trying to control him. He learned that the nobles thought the throne was theirs to guide. And as he got older, he started to hate that feeling. Then came the moment that made young Richard famous across England. In 1381, when Richard was only 14, England exploded. Years of high taxes and hard living pushed people over the edge. A massive uprising began, later called the Peasants' Revolt. Crowds marched on London, buildings were burned, officials were hunted, important men were killed. The rebels had a leader named Wat Tyler, and they wanted answers, not from the nobles, but from the king himself. And Richard did something that shocked everyone. He went out to meet them. Imagine that scene, a teenage king riding toward angry crowds who had already killed powerful people, while the city around him was in chaos. Richard faced them anyway. At first it worked. He spoke directly to the rebels, promised reforms, and tried to calm the situation. At one key moment after Wat Tyler was killed during a tense meeting, Richard rode forward to take control of the crowd. Chroniclers report him basically telling them that he would lead them and they should follow him. For a boy king, it looked like courage. But the truth is, the revolt was a warning that the country was fragile and that royal authority could crack fast. The revolt was crushed soon after, and many promises were not kept. And Richard learned another lesson. Crowds can be calmed, but power is held by force, and by the people with money, land, and soldiers. As Richard moved into adulthood, he became more determined to rule in his own way. He married Anne of Bohemia in 1382. It was a political marriage, but by many accounts, Richard genuinely cared for her. The marriage also brought him connections and status in Europe, and Richard liked that. He liked ceremony. He liked being seen as special. But inside England, he still had a problem. The nobles expected to run things. Richard began choosing favorites, close friends and advisors, and he rewarded them heavily. One of the most important early figures was Michael de la Pole, a trusted advisor who became very powerful. Another was Robert de Vere, a close friend Richard lifted up with major titles. To Richard, these men were loyal. To the nobles, they were parasites feeding off the king. By the mid-1380s, the tension turned into open conflict. A group of top nobles formed around the idea that Richard was being misled by bad advisors. They became known as the Lords Appellant. This wasn't a polite disagreement. This was the kind of politics where accusations could end in prison or execution. In 1387, things moved towards civil war. Richard tried to fight back by raising forces, including support from his loyal areas. But the Lords Appellant defeated the king's side at Radcot Bridge. Richard's friend Robert de Vere fled. Richard himself was cornered. Now picture Richard at about 20 years old, still young but no longer a child, forced to face the fact that powerful men could still overpower him. Then came the event known as the Merciless Parliament in 1388. It was called merciless for a reason. Richard's closest advisors were accused of treason. Many were executed, others were exiled. The king was humiliated in public, and for a while his enemies essentially controlled the government while Richard sat on the throne like a symbol. This period is important because it shaped Richard's personality. He didn't forget what they did. He didn't forgive. He waited. In 1389, Richard began to regain control. Partly this happened because politics shifted, and partly because John of Gaunt returned and helped stabilize things. Richard announced he would rule for himself, and he began a period that looked calmer on the surface. For a few years, Richard tried to act like a proper king, dealing with Parliament, negotiating, balancing factions. But underneath, he was planning. He had learned something from his humiliation. If the nobles could use the system to crush his friends, then he could use the system to crush them. In 1394, Queen Anne died. Richard was devastated. He took it hard and became harsher. After this, many people noticed a change. Less patience, more anger, more cold focus. 2 years later, in 1396, Richard married again. This time Isabella of Valois, a young French princess. That marriage was part of a peace deal with France during the 100 Years' War. Richard wanted peace. He believed long truces and royal authority could make England stable. But some nobles saw peace with France as weakness, and others simply disliked the idea of Richard acting like a king above them. Then Richard made his move. In 1397, he struck back at the men who had humiliated him a decade earlier. This is one of the most important turning points in his whole story. Richard arrested major nobles who had led the opposition, people like the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Arundel. Arundel was executed. Gloucester died in custody under suspicious circumstances. Others were forced into submission. Richard didn't just punish them. He also took their lands and used Parliament and courts to make it look legal. Now, for the first time, Richard wasn't being controlled by nobles. He was controlling them. But he didn't stop there. Over the next couple of years, Richard began ruling in a way that made many people afraid. He used loyal officials. He raised money aggressively. He demanded obedience. He built a stronger personal power base. He acted more and more like a king whose word should be final. And he started making decisions that were politically suicidal. One famous event was the clash between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. Both were powerful nobles. Richard forced them into a formal trial by combat, then cancelled it at the last moment and punished both men with exile. Henry Bolingbroke was not just any noble. He was the son of John of Gaunt, and he was Richard's cousin. Exiling him created quiet rage in the noble class because it showed nobody was safe from Richard's punishments. Then in 1399, John of Gaunt died. This was huge. John of Gaunt was one of the richest and most powerful men in England. His lands and wealth were supposed to pass to Henry Bolingbroke. But Richard stepped in and seized the inheritance. And then he made it worse by extending Henry's exile. This was the moment Richard basically dared the political world to overthrow him. Because now it wasn't just "the king is harsh." It was "the king will take your family wealth and destroy your future." And nobles across England looked at that and thought, if he can do it to Henry, he can do it to any of us. Then Richard left England. He went on campaign in Ireland in 1399. He needed to assert control there, and he believed he had the situation in England locked down. But leaving was the mistake, because while Richard was away, Henry Bolingbroke returned. Henry landed in England and claimed at first that he only wanted his inheritance back. That was a smart move because it sounded reasonable, not like treason, and people rallied to him fast. Nobles who disliked Richard joined Henry. Powerful families supported him. Even people who weren't nobles often preferred Henry because he looked like a stronger, more normal king than Richard. Meanwhile, Richard was still in Ireland, hearing delayed news, losing control by the day. When Richard finally returned to England, the world had changed. Henry had taken London. Richard's support collapsed. Even some of the men who had served him began switching sides. Richard tried to gather forces and fight back, but he was too late and too isolated. He ended up at Flint Castle in Wales, where Henry's forces closed in. Richard was captured. Imagine what that must have felt like, a king who had once crushed the greatest nobles in the land, now trapped, watched, powerless, realizing that all his fear and control could disappear in weeks. Richard was taken to London as a prisoner. Then something happened that mattered far beyond Richard's own life. England removed its king. Richard was forced to give up the throne. The official process was wrapped in legal steps and speeches, but the core truth was simple. The king was taken off the throne and replaced by another man. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV. This is why Richard II is so historically important. His downfall created a model. It showed that a king could be replaced if enough power gathered against him. That idea would haunt England for generations. As for Richard, he was imprisoned and moved around. Eventually, he was held at Pontefract Castle. In February 1400, Richard died in captivity, around the age of 33. Many believe he starved, whether by neglect or by force. Rumors of murder spread quickly. The new king had strong reasons to make sure Richard could never become a symbol for rebellion. Richard's body was later displayed publicly to prove he was truly dead. And that was the end of Richard II, born into royal glory, crowned as a child, famous at 14 for facing rebels, humiliated by nobles in his 20s, returning as a king hungry for control, ruling harshly in revenge, and finally losing everything because he pushed too far, until England decided it would rather risk a new king than keep him. And the consequences didn't end with his death. Henry IV's takeover didn't magically fix England. It created new questions. Who truly has the right to rule? What happens when a king is removed? And if it happened once, could it happen again? Richard II's fall didn't just end one reign. It helped open the door to the long and bloody struggles over the English crown that would come later.